So by way of agenda, we only have about 12 slides today. I'm going to talk a little bit about each of the slides, and I'm going to give you some examples and some case studies of things that I've done. And please feel free to send us your questions in that chat box at the bottom. That would be really helpful, and we'll go ahead and answer those questions as we can. Feel free to interrupt. I have no issues with that. I'm happy to have that discussion. So agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about the value of data governance. I anticipate that most of you on the phone here have a sense for your own organizations of what the value of data governance is. But I have some boilerplate stuff that's helpful for us to discuss from a sort of a baseline perspective of what is the value of data governance. We'll certainly talk a fair amount about data governance structure. This is, I get a lot of questions around that. Where do you put data governance? Who's responsible for it? Those kinds of questions. So, you know, I think that we'll talk a fair amount about that. If you have any questions, again, feel free to send that in. We're going to talk a little bit about data stewards. You know, they're really the heart of any kind of data governance program. A lot of organizations have data stewards embedded already. They just aren't calling them that. So we'll talk a little bit about skill set, experience, organizational implications, again, you know, who is responsible for data stewards, where does it reside in the organization, that kind of a thing. Certainly we'll talk a little bit about metadata. I don't get into that in any great detail. Metadata is a topic all on its own, but suffice it to say that metadata is critically important to a data governance structure as a whole. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And obviously data quality is probably the primary driver to any organization deciding to undertake a data governance exercise. So we're going to talk a fair amount about that. I'm going to propose a rather challenging question to you. But the idea is, you know, who really owns data quality? We've probably all read those articles in magazines about who's responsible for data quality, and it depends on who's writing the article as to what the perspective is. Again, where does that function reside organizationally? I think we all sort of are comfortable with the idea that quality assurance resides in an IT perspective, but where does data quality as an ownership perspective really reside? So those are some of those questions. And then decision rights, and interestingly enough, from a governance perspective, this is the question that always has a lot of passion around it, shall we say. And the idea there is, who is responsible from a decision rights perspective? Who is that person that makes that final decision about what's going to happen and what isn't going to happen? So that is our agenda. Then we have another poll question for you. Go ahead and pop that up here, and if you could just take a couple of minutes to go ahead and answer that poll question for us. Again, helps us to understand where everyone is at. So the vast majority of you do not have a data governance program in place, so this is perfect, really. We are at the point where, you know, we're going to talk about this as a starter kit, if you will. So I think that works out quite well for most of you. For those of you that do, perhaps some of these slides will provide you some valuable insight into where to take the next step or how to get restarted. All right, so the value of data governance. And again, you probably have that perspective of the value specific to your organization, but here's some basic ones I think that we're probably all familiar with. Probably the best definition from a value of data governance perspective is it allows the business to determine what's being done and when in a controlled and thoughtful methodology. And I think the key term there is business. A couple of specific bullet points, obviously not limited to, this isn't a completely exhaustive list. But the first and foremost, again, why most people attempt to do this is improve data quality. Consistent business definitions of business terms is the one thing that is probably the most challenging aspect of data governance, but provides the most value in the long run. Decision-making based on data, sort of really about the confidence in the data. So, you know, the idea of, we all have these scenarios or these examples of how this is played out, but your executives are meeting and they have one question and two different answers to the same question, and there's always that seed of doubt that's been planted about the confidence in the data and how accurate the data is. Data governance helps address a lot of those issues. Collaboration among business units. So we have disparate business units. They're using the same data, defining it differently, using it differently. Bringing those business units together from this collaborative perspective really helps drive a lot of shared understanding throughout the organization about what your data is and how it should be used, which leads directly into appropriate use of data. A lot of people get uncomfortable with that statement, but This is really a keystone of data governance. You know, we don't want people out there using data inappropriately. That's how you get two different answers to the same question. Sharing data internally, an obvious benefactor of governance. And the regulatory compliance, you know, because I specialize in healthcare, I live and breathe compliance. Sometimes have nightmares about it. So this is a really important aspect of that. Audit controls built into a governance structure can really provide a lot of comfort to those folks that are in highly regulated industries. And probably the unsung hero of the value of data governance is the simplified and known, so therefore stated and communicated data management business processes. If you're in any kind of a management role, you know that expectations and expectation management is a key thing that management has to do, and data governance is no exception. If you can manage expectations and state your process so that everybody knows where you're at and what you're doing, that will provide a great deal of value to the organization. All right, I think we'll have another poll question for you here. Is it impossible to have 100% data accuracy? I'm betting we have some finance people on the phone. This is really meant to be pretty titillating. I'm trying to sort of push the envelope here a little bit. But the idea here is data exists almost by definition, the creation by people. So if we have a system either in a retail store or in a healthcare organization, if people didn't create the data originally to put it into an application, people are touching it as you move through that system, right? As you move that data from the application into your ETL path, into your data warehouse itself, into the BI presentation letter. There are people involved in every step of that way. And people, unfortunately, generally inherently mean a fair amount of opportunity for error. So I think we're really at a disadvantage right off the cuff talking about the idea of 100% data quality. Now, does that mean that I am a proponent of poor data quality? Absolutely not. And I think what an organization needs to do, and what I recommend organizations need to do, is aim for just enough data quality. Just enough will mean something different to every organization, but what it really means is that you have enough so that everybody's comfortable and has a high degree of confidence in that data quality. The biggest factor to data quality is, particularly on the 100% idea, is that you have to understand there are cost implications to a data quality exercise. And they may not be direct cost implications, it may be relatively indirect. So you might have somebody behind the scenes sort of running on their little wheel trying to get that 100% data quality. A good example is a few years back I was working with a health system based out of the northwest region of our country. Their second year into a deployment of a data warehouse and a BI software tool. And I asked a silly question like, why is it taking so long? Because I was new to the customer. And 2 years in was pretty unusual for us. It usually took 6 to 8 months to implement a data warehouse and the BI tool. And they had decided when they started that they really were aiming for 99.9%, so fundamentally 100% data quality on their warehouse. And it took them about 4 years to complete that exercise. And I can't tell you the cost associated with that. It's really astronomical. They were literally chasing down a 0.01 variance in a cell, all the way down to the business processes, right down to the person that created the data, and changing business processes and creating documentation associated with that, and the whole shebang. You know, the important thing is at the end of that project, they really felt good about what they had done, and I suppose that has a lot of value. But the dollar value associated with, you know, the cost versus the benefit analysis on that, I'd be hard-pressed to believe that it would be positive. So, you know, that's something we all need to think about, whether you're on the business side or the IT side, is you need to get to just enough so that everybody's comfortable, but you don't want to be chasing down a 0.01% variance on a cell and costing the organization money for very little benefit at the end of the day. So where does that leave us? You know, we push for as high a data quality as we can possibly reach. But the great thing is if you focus on data governance and stewardship, that's really going to help get us quite the distance there. So what I mean by this is governance and stewardship is as sort of part of that governance structure really provides a framework and parameters and expectation setting about what the data quality is for your organization, processes and procedures that you do in order to get you as close to 100% as possible, as close to that just enough data quality for your organization. So just the idea that you have a governance structure in place and you have the maturity associated with that really helps drive a lot of confidence in your data quality. The other thing that's very important from this perspective is that creating metadata, maintaining your metadata, and using metadata will be incredibly beneficial, not only from a governance perspective, but from a knowledge perspective, a communications perspective, and expectation management perspective. So if you have metadata repository that users can log into and find out exactly what metric exists where, and how it's defined, and how they find it, the better off you're going to be as you go through this path. So I think we just got a question here, and the question is, regarding data quality, how do you negotiate what is good enough? And I think that's a great question, and I hear it pretty frequently. The idea here is the most important thing that we need to know is that you can define data quality differently for each of your data domains or each of your sort of logical data structures. So let's pick on finance. Let's say that your finance organization comes back and says, you know what, this is really unacceptable to me. I absolutely have to have 99.9% data accuracy or data quality, and the 0.1% that's missing, I have to have a really good reason why. And that's fine. That's what then you should apply to your finance data domain. But maybe operations comes back to you and says, you know what, I think 95% is pretty accurate for me. It makes me feel like I have a high degree of confidence in the data, and I'm comfortable with that. So you can have different thresholds of just enough for each of the separate data domains. And really the only way to get there, to figure out where that just enough is for each of those data domains, is you have to have those conversations with those folks that are responsible for that data or that functional area in your business. So go to your CFO or go to your VP of finance or your controller and start talking about this concept and have those conversations with them and see where you can negotiate to. I think that's really an important conversation to have. Another aspect of that you want to keep in mind is you should have these conversations as early on in the project as possible. And the reason why is it's a lot more difficult to have an objective discussion about data quality standards or parameters before you have a data quality issue. If you start down your data governance path and you start down a data warehouse path and you run into a data quality issue and business comes back to you and says you need to fix it, but you don't have any parameters in place or a data quality standard in place, I guarantee you they're going to push you really hard to get it resolved 100%. And you'll spend a lot of time in that rabbit hole of data quality analysis. So try to get that done before you really start down your data governance and data warehousing path, if you can. So there are a lot of articles, presentations, experts out there on data governance, and God bless them all. It really is a broad sort of industry perspective on this work, but having done this before, having created data governance structures before, one of the things that I am a really big proponent of is keeping it really simple. I don't know any organization that needs more committees. I don't know any organization that needs more to do. And data governance, I think a lot of the barriers to entry from a data governance perspective is most organizations feel like it's going to be so exhaustive and so difficult for them to do it within the constraints of doing their business today. In other words, I'm already so busy, how do I add something else on, that it really prevents them from moving forward. So what I propose is a really simplified structure, and it breaks down to this. We all have seen this pyramid visual 1,000 different times in 1,000 different ways. It's very popular in the data warehousing space, but really this is meant to imply quantity. So your data stewards are the thing you have the most of. That doesn't mean you have a lot of them, and by the way, it doesn't mean that they're FTEs, but you have more data stewards than you have just about anything else. That might mean you have 3 of them. You have a data steward working group, so getting those folks together in the same room and having conversations. Then you have your steering committee, and this is where a lot of the responsibility resides from a governance perspective, governance responsibility, and then all the way up to your executive staff. So You got to get those folks involved, and it's an escalation / approval. You know, they're not going to be down there analyzing metrics or determining, you know, where a metric comes from, but they do need to be involved from an escalation perspective if these previous entities can't resolve the issue, or a final approval. Some executive staff really want to be involved in the final approval of definitions that are really core to their business. Things like for healthcare, it's patients and members. There's a difference between those two things. They really want to be involved in those. Other industries, customer is always a big one, you know. So executive staff really like to be involved in that because it will guide a lot of the analysis and could potentially change a lot of the analysis that's already been done if you're changing the way you define customer for your organization. So very, very simple structure. So this is a related slide, and so if you think about the previous structure that I had that we just talked about, this is really putting it into an org chart perspective. At the bottom you have that informed decision making, and we call this the BI team member. That's really your data steward. That's really your data steward role, and they're informing. They're doing a lot of the work. They're running a lot of the queries. They're doing a lot of the running around and figuring out what happened kind of a thing. Then you have that decision-making layer, and that's the governance council that's actually responsible for that. Now you can have 1 or 2 layers of that decision-making. I have represented here 2, but it's really completely acceptable to have just your governance council. But the idea here is that you can have a separate council or members at large that provide information or support back to that governance council. So for example, in one program that I helped build, we had this advisory board was really the team of analysts that were across the organization. They were in disparate business functions. They weren't the data stewards. They didn't have a depth of knowledge on a particular functional, you know, area. They had more cross-functional perspective. They had much more traditional analytic capability sets like statistical analysis, that kind of a thing. But their value, their knowledge of the data and how it was used was really invaluable to us. So we created a formal structure that was really an advisory board back to the governance structure at that level. That does not mean that you need to do that, but it's something that you could do if you have something similar. And then it's obviously your senior staff who meet and set strategic direction for your organization. And the idea here is that you take the people that are already there and you take the committees that already exist. So my bet is that you have people that are data stewards in your organization. We just don't call them that. The good question to ask when you're thinking about data stewards is, who would you go to if you had a question about the data? And sometimes the answer is IT, and sometimes it's not. But you know that usually leads you at some point to a data steward. And the governance council level, if you have a BI program or a data warehouse up and running, or you have started one, you've generally attempted to get a group of stakeholders together to help inform that work. That's your governance council. So just ask them to add this to their agenda as being responsible for this. You may need to add a member or 2, or you may need to be creative about how you schedule it, so you have to schedule meetings more frequently. But I'm guessing that nobody really wants to be on another committee, so using an existing committee is really helpful. And again, your senior staff, they're already meeting. Maybe once in a while you can add something to their agenda so that they can participate in this as well and be knowledgeable about what's happening in the organization overall. And we have another poll question. So if you could take a few minutes to answer this question. This is really more of just a curiosity from my perspective. I've given this presentation a number of times now, and I'm sort of at a 50-50 on this. About 50% of the time people say yes, about 50% of the time people say no. They really don't have anything they can adopt. And that's fine. You know, if you don't have something that you can adopt, then you probably, you know, we need to create something anyway in order to support this function. So it's not like you're, you know, out of luck, so to speak. Okay, so pretty close. 56% said yes and 44% said no. So it's sort of along the lines. Within a statistically valid sample of probably a margin of error, we're at the close to 50-50 split there. So let's talk a little bit about the steering committee and what they're responsible for. The steering committee is represented by data owners, or the data owners are the steering committee. It's probably a better way to say that. Those data owners are representing a key business area or key functional area. I'm making this a very broad sort of sweeping statement, but you have finance, you have operations, you have sales and marketing. Those are organizations that we can all sort of relate to. And you have a data owner that's responsible for that functional area. And they need to be aligned with the BI governance and the program itself. So in other words, they need to be a stakeholder in the success of your data warehouse and your BI program. They need to really want that to be a success because they need to make decisions based on data. If they're not really feeling like success from that perspective is important to them, then they're probably not going to be very helpful from a steering committee perspective. The steering committee is responsible for creating a policies and procedures document. They enforce, obviously, then those policies and procedures. They ensure that the work of whatever you call your team, data management, IT, IM, is aligned with the corporate strategy. And I'm always surprised at how often we miss this mark. But if we're not attributing the success of our data warehouse, our BI program, and as a result then our data governance program back to a specific statement in our corporate mission or our guiding principles or our vision, whatever that is that for your organization, I think we're all at a really big disadvantage. So you need to make sure that you're aligned, and where possible you're measuring against that connection, if you will. So you have a statement where you're trying to grow your business, data warehousing is helping grow the business by doing X and such, and you have an ability to measure that. Sort of a tangent for me, it has nothing to do with governance, but it's really important. Obviously, you champion BI and data governance to the broader organization as a steering committee member. And then they review and approve recommendations from the Data Steward Working Group regarding terms, definitions, quality standards, and thresholds. At the end of the day, this is the buck stops here group that comes to the vast majority of how you use data, the definitions, appropriate usage, all of those kind of hallmarks of a data governance program. So it can be a lot of work, particularly in the beginning as you get things started, but it's important work from a governance perspective. And then the Data Stewardship Working Group. I have to tell you that obviously data stewards are at the heart of any governance program, but just the function of getting all your data stewards in a room is incredibly valuable to your organization. And as a matter of fact, will probably take your data governance project far into the future just based on that alone. And the reason why is they're all sort of like-minded people, right? And they feel a lot of ownership and passion around their data, which, by the way, also causes issues later on. But in the beginning, they are so intrinsically motivated to reduce the friction between how things are defined or where things come from that they will just sort of work on their own to get that done and taken care of. I think the only downside of that is if I were to stereotype this particular person that tends to be very intrinsically motivated by this work, none of them are great at documentation. So they might get some really great work done, but you might see sporadic documentation associated with that. So you want to make sure that when these folks meet, you have somebody that's a designated note taker in those meetings. But it's incredibly valuable to have this data stewardship working group put together as part of your formal data governance structure. It's really, really valuable in the long run. Now, data stewards obviously are subject matter experts in their field. The field can be defined and will be defined a little bit differently for each organization. They're aligned with the business units represented in the steering committee. So you have a data steward that reports up directly to a data owner. And, there might be a couple of levels of management in between, but for the most part, there is a direct line up between the data owners and the data stewards. The data stewards review issues with data and they make recommendations. They ensure the work is aligned with the policies and procedures. Each steward will ensure proper usage, accessibility, and quality of the information within their data domain. That is the main responsibility of the stewards. And as long as you have good parameters defined for those data stewards in your policies and procedures document, they can operate within those parameters pretty independently. They establish enterprise-wide standards for data quality and appropriate usage as associated with their data domain. And they ensure conformity, extensibility, security, and compliance. So data stewards is incredibly important to the governance program overall. We have a question here. How many data stewards does a company need? Is it a full-time position? Sort of reminds me of how many IT people does it take to turn on a computer kind of a question. So the answer is it depends. That's my official consultant's answer. It depends. And it depends on a couple of things. So how many data stewards does your company need? What you want to look at is your data and how it sort of stacks up from a data domain perspective. So you have, I'm not a finance person, so I'm going to go to the healthcare example, so please bear with me. In healthcare, you have two things called eligibility and benefits. You can be eligible, and that is, do you have, are you covered by, like, say, a Blue Cross or United Health? And then you have a benefit, which is what kind of benefits are you covered by? Do you have an HSA? Do you have an HMO? That type of a thing. Those two are really important from a healthcare perspective, but the usage associated with those, it really varies a great deal. So eligibility, when you're running almost any kind of analysis, you need to know who's eligible and who's not. And so that is a very frequently used data domain, and in most situations we want a data steward that's 100% dedicated to that data domain. By the way, it's not a lot of data. Depending on how many people you cover or are being covered, depending on what perspective you have, it's not a lot of data. It's are they eligible, yes or no, and the dates associated with that eligibility. But it's used so frequently that for a healthcare organization, eligibility is really important, and it usually requires a full-time data steward to support that and answer all the questions associated with that and keep really vigilant that that data quality is kept to a really high standard. On the benefit side, well, we don't really use that nearly as much, and there's a lot more data associated with it. So there are lots of different product structures that you can have as a member that's covered, and so there's a lot of data, but from an analytics perspective or a usage perspective, we don't use it that much. Maybe 33% of all analyses, if you are a payer or a United Health Group, a Blue Cross Blue Shield, is really looking at benefit structures and associated value of benefit structures and who's in what benefit and all of that. So we don't assign a full-time data steward to that data domain, even though there's a lot of data from a quantity perspective. So that's sort of the answer. And is it a full-time position? Not necessarily. You can do this however it's comfortable for your organization. But I see a lot of small to mid-sized organizations creating these as roles. So somebody is already probably doing this as a part of their analytic role, and you just add data steward responsibilities to that. But you can also have an FTE that is a data steward. And another question here, can the same person belong to different groups? So can the same person, I'm assuming the question is, can the same person, one data steward, have responsibility for multiple data domains? And the answer to that is absolutely. Particularly if those data domains overlap a great deal. So in the example I just gave, eligibility and benefits, oddly enough, they don't overlap all that much. In order to be eligible, you have to have, or in order to have a benefit, you have to be eligible. But from an analytics perspective, the only time we really need to know about eligibility is when you're looking at people that are no longer eligible and you want to look at their product lineup. But if they have a benefit, then they are by definition eligible. So those two, they don't overlap a lot. But there are lots of other examples where there's lots of overlap between data domains, and you want to take advantage of those overlaps, so you can absolutely assign one data steward to 2 different data domains. All right. So here's some steps to getting started. 5, I want to say relatively simple, but they're relatively simple because they're on a slide. The devil is in the details, as it always is. So, it's the who, what, why, when, how. So who, the first thing you want to do is identify your participants. Find those data stewards that already exist in your organization. They're already doing this work. You just don't call them a data steward. And find your committee representatives. So determine your business stakeholders, those functional areas that are stakeholders back to the BI and data warehousing program. Ask them to sit on this committee and help you govern and create a data management capability. The what, then, as a result of that, first place you need to start is creating that policies and procedures document. These documents can get pretty extensive, but the idea here is, in this policies and procedures document, if somebody that's new to the organization comes into the organization, they can pick up that document, read through it, and know exactly how your data governance structure works. They know who's responsible for what. They know when things get done. They know why things get done. They know how things get done. So that document is really critical to success of your data governance structure. So begin education regarding governance, and the why here is your executives, your analysts, people are going to start asking you, well, why are we doing this? So you really need to educate around governance and what it means to the organization and what success looks like for the organization and you know, what the cost looks like for the organization, because your executives are going to ask different questions than your analysts will, so you'll need to create a couple of different subset of presentations or education regarding governance for those different audiences. The when concept here is telling people what you're going to deliver in the next 6 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever time frame you're looking at. But these 5 things don't have to be hard. They just need to get you started. So you're going to tell people, the first thing I'm going to do is identify the data stewards. And the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find the committee representatives. And the third thing we're going to do is create the policies and procedures document. And the fourth thing we're going to do is educate the, the organization. And the fifth thing we're going to do is create a communications portal out for the organization to know what's going on in the data governance program. Which leads me to the next sort of getting started step, and that is create a plan to consistently communicate. And I have to tell you that this is the most important aspect of your data governance function from a management perspective. You can be doing the best data governance stuff in the world, but if you're not telling people what you're doing, it really doesn't matter how great you are at it. So you really want to be able to consistently communicate out to your organization. And this is a great way to do it. You know, a few years ago this wasn't even possible, but now it really is. The idea of a wiki. And, I use Wikipedia because everybody's really comfortable with that. But this really is about a collaboration site on your organization. So SharePoint's a really good example. And it's a great way to manage this because you can have private sort of aspects of your collaboration site and public aspects of your collaboration site. So all your data stewards can be using that collaboration site, sending messages back and forth, sending files back and forth, saving content out there like documents where they're creating statements about metrics and that kind of a thing. And then you can have a public aspect of that where people can actually comment on how things are defined or where data comes from, because if you're a big organization, you have a lot of sophisticated users. They might know something that someone doesn't, so it's really beneficial to have that two-way communication. I got a question on that one. What software products would you recommend to create a data governance collaboration site? And I mentioned SharePoint. There's also a bunch of different collaboration sites online. Some of them are free. Some of them there's an incremental cost. And, they kind of vary in capability as far as public versus private aspects of the site, that kind of a thing. So SharePoint's obviously the easiest one. Most of us have Microsoft. You can Google collaboration site, and there's a couple of different ones. Huddle.net is one that I use. I think we have a poll question before we go to this next. One more poll question for you. I think we're at 5. And I got another, while you're doing that, I got another question in here. Who typically starts the quest for a data governance program? And I would say 9 times out of 10 it's almost always IT. And that's because IT is the one that feels the most pain associated with not having a governance program and not having business really participate in data quality exercises. So it really is almost an IT thing that organization is the one that, asks for help, gets this kicked off because there's so much pain associated with it. Now, over time, as you create this, business should absolutely take over. Data quality is a business issue. IT helps execute against that, but IT does not own the data. Business really does. So IT starts it, but at the end of the day, business needs to own that. Looks like about half of you want to get started in the next 6 months, a quarter of you in the next year, and another quarter of you really more than a year. You're going to take some time. So good to know. Thank you. Appreciate that. By the way, I have no way of knowing who answered what, so I'm not going to harass you, but I do have to talk a little bit about my Lancet propaganda, so please give me a few moments here. Allow me the liberty to talk a little bit about this data governance starter kit. And I have to tell you, because I have done this before, because I have owned a governance structure in an organization before, governance is a very personal journey. It has to exist within the ecosystem of your organization. You can sort of try to create this cookie-cutter governance structure based on best practices, but every organization is different, and their culture is different, and their functional areas are different, and the people that work in the organization have different needs and wants. So, you know, you see one data governance program, you've seen one data governance program, and it needs to be very customized to your organization and very, very agile in order to really be successful. So governance is a very personal journey, and I absolutely believe that. It really is. But sometimes on a personal journey, you need a counselor. You need somebody to guide you to avoid the pitfalls that that person has already fallen into. So what I have created is what I call a 4-week intensive therapy session. And by the way, it doesn't have to be 4 weeks. I have working with a client right now on the starter kit, and they said to me, you know what, this is really great. We need some help on this, but there is no way we're going to be able to do this in 4 weeks. We need more time, and so we made it 8 weeks instead, and that's totally acceptable. Again, it has to exist within your organization. And the things that I'll do with in this starter kit is I help identify your participants. You know, I'll be asking a lot of questions. I'll be walking around figuring out who those data stewards are, help create a lot of that educational curriculum, those presentations that you give to your executives versus the analysts. I assist in the creation of the policies and procedures document, which can be a pretty lengthy document to create. And then I help create a communication action plan, you know, creating things like collaboration sites and all of those other things that are really helpful from a communications perspective for your governance program. So all of this, templates already exist for all of this. I've done this before, and I've created templates based off of those exercises. But obviously, each of those templates have to be customized in order to make it work for your organization. So I'll take the boilerplate education presentations that I already have, and we're going to add in things that are specific to your organization. We're going to take the policies and procedures template that I already have, and we're going to add things that are really specific to your organization, etc. So that is that. So a couple of next steps for you. We are doing a little experiment on virtual collaboration. Speaking of collaboration sites or wikis, and I have a collaboration site online. I'm using Huddle.net, and we're talking about a lot of things associated with BI and data warehousing, not just governance, but governance is one aspect of that. So if you're interested in participating, please go ahead and email me and I can add you to that. One note on that is a public domain. So if you're out there and you're talking about things that you're dealing with, it's public, so other people will see your statements. I don't know that they see the organization that you work for unless you disclose that. I'm not really sure. They may see your email. Because I'm an administrator, I'm not sure how end users see it. That's my disclaimer for you. But right now I have people in all kinds of different industries, manufacturing, retail, healthcare, and coming at it from all different maturity levels. So it's been really interesting to take a look at that, and I hope to get some really good discussions going on so you can talk and network, essentially virtually network with your peers across the country. The other thing that might be helpful to you is I wrote an article about a year ago that's on the BI network, so that's exactly like it's spelled there, BEYEnetwork.com. And the article is called In Search of Good Data Stewards, a guide to finding them in your organization. That also includes some job descriptions and stuff like that that may be helpful as you start this journey. And I have that link. If you guys can't find it on BINetwork.com, just feel free to email me, and I'd be happy to send you that link to that. So with all that said, I think we have just a few minutes for a couple of questions. Question here that was sent in a little bit ago. What are the biggest obstacles to implementing a data governance capability? Great question. Get asked that one a lot. And so obstacles vary as you progress through the maturity of a data governance function. So in the beginning, the primary obstacle that you'll hear a lot, or the challenge that you'll hear a lot, is I don't have time for this. I'm just too darn busy. And it's probably true in the world that we all live in. Everybody's got way too much to do. But if you do data governance right, it might be a little bit more intense in the beginning, but in the long run, it's going to save you some time. So that's a pretty easy thing to answer for folks. As you move through the maturity cycle, then the next sort of question that you'll get is things like, well, what is this going to cost me? You know, what's the value? Can you quantify the value to the organization? Obviously, executives tend to ask that question a lot. And there are methods of pertaining to ROI for governance. It has a lot to do with chasing down metrics and they're obviously related to things that you do from a ROI calculation perspective on the data warehouse. Eventually, you get down to the point where you have people arguing about how things are defined and where they come from and who actually owns them. And that's the bread and butter stuff that you get in any kind of data governance program. And honestly, those are really challenging things to work through, because as you get moving along on this, you'll find, if you haven't already found this, that data is very personal to folks, and they really feel very strongly about it. So they will get pretty worked up about something where if they feel like something of theirs is being violated or different from how they've looked at it. So obstacles will definitely happen, and they will pop up in every phase of your governance program, and they'll change over time as your maturity improves. And as long as you know that and are prepared for those obstacles, I think that you'll do just fine. So another question here, how is data governance related to a BI program? Generally speaking, data governance is embedded in your BI program, and really you need data governance in order for your BI program to be successful in the long run. Another talk I give fairly frequently is proven strategies to increasing user adoption, and one of the three sort of staples to that I contend is trust in the data, and trust is directly related to governance, and user adoption is incredibly important to the BI program overall. You know, generally speaking, data governance, does it reside in a BI program from an organizational perspective? Does stewards report to a BI director? Generally not. Stewards should reside in their own functional area and should have a dotted line back to the data governance structure. They need to reside in that business function so they know that data really well and understand the processes associated with that. But there is definitely a dotted line back to your BI program, because success is really dependent on that. Good question that just came in. How do you build a business case and sell to leaders? What has been effective that you have seen? Well, in healthcare, it's really all about the risk. I sold a data governance program just almost exclusively on that, because you can have good audit controls for embedded in your governance structure that you really can't have if you don't have that. So if you're in any kind of a regulatory industry, any kind of industry that's highly regulated by, you know, SOX or HIPAA or anything like that, just risk and risk avoidance is a really, really good way to sell it. Another great opportunity is a book called IT Governance, which actually I have literally right in front of me. I was just doing some research earlier today for a client. It's written by Weil and Ross, Weil, W-E-I-L-L. And as a matter of fact, I think if you go to lancetsoftware.com, we have a bookstore, and I think it's listed out there. That's a great book. It talks about IT governance as a whole, but it talks about information governance as a subset of IT governance. That's another conversation, but let's pretend that's a good idea. It's not a bad idea, by the way. And in that book, it talks a lot about associated value to governance as a structure, and it comes back time and time again to the idea that if you have good governance structures in place, your return on assets is almost always higher, ranging somewhere between 20 to 40%. So you can really talk in a very valid way about return on investment and return on assets. So that's a good resource for you. You know, another really important thing for you to do is just think about it from your executive's perspective. Your organization might be different. It might be in a different place. It might need to be sort of staying where you're at and really sort of towing the line because of the market right now. So how can governance help toe the line? Or maybe you're in a growth phase and you really need to grow very fast in order to compete with some people that have, you know, come up behind during this downturn in the market. Figure out how governance can address that and present that to your executives. Figure out what's really at the heart. So I do have just another minute here, but I do have some more questions, but I want to wrap up on time. So thank you so much for your time today and your attention. I really appreciate it. Very helpful for me to talk about this stuff for you. Thanks again, everybody.